Informed consent is the most important process in protecting the rights of patients participating in clinical trials. Patients who participate in a clinical trial have to consent to take part in a study voluntarily, and not because the doctor asks them to. Unlike the previous ethical standards, Good Clinical Practice, GCP guideline, provides sufficient details and clear instructions on how to conduct an informed consent process, and the content of the informed consent form. Everything stated in GCP should be followed, and no improvisation is allowed. So let us start with the definition. According to the Good Clinical Practice, GCP guideline, informed consent is a process by which a subject voluntarily confirms his or her willingness to participate in a particular trial, after having been informed of all aspects of the trial that are relevant to the subject's decision to participate. Informed consent is documented by means of a written, signed and dated informed consent form. As you can see from the definition, GCP considers informed consent as a process, not just as a form or a document. The importance of the informed consent process, as the most important process in protecting the rights of patients participating in clinical trials, can also be seen in the fact that it is one of the 13 GCP principles. The 9th principle of GCP is, freely given informed consent should be obtained from every subject, prior to clinical trial participation. The detailed instructions of the informed consent process are part of Section 4 of GCP, under the investigator's responsibilities. After all, in all previous ethical standards, the informed consent process is directly related to the doctor-patient relationship. Although, most of the text in the GCP guideline is self-explanatory, in this presentation, we shall try to give more clarifications of certain parts of the GCP. In obtaining and documenting informed consent, the investigator should comply with the applicable regulatory requirements, and should adhere to GCP, and to the ethical principles that have their origin in the Declaration of Helsinki. Prior to the beginning of the trial, the investigator should have the IEC's written approval or favorable opinion of the written informed consent form, and any other written information to be provided to subjects. In other words, the investigator must comply with the legal framework and obtain IEC or any other regulatory approval, for the use of an informed consent form, before the clinical trial. The investigator should not make any subsequent changes to the already approved informed consent form. All changes to the informed consent form must be approved by the IEC, and/or competent regulatory authority. The written informed consent form, and any other written information to be provided to subjects, should be revised whenever important new information becomes available, that may be relevant to the subject's consent. Any revised written informed consent form, and written information should receive the IEC's approval or favorable opinion in advance of use. The subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative, should be informed in a timely manner if new information becomes available, that may be relevant to the subject's willingness to continue participation in the trial. The communication of this information should be documented. To avoid misunderstandings, please note that the usual procedure is that the sponsor prepares written information for the patient, including the informed consent form, not the investigator. Also, the sponsor is the entity that makes sure that all necessary documents are approved by IEC, and competent regulatory authorities before or during the study. The investigator can provide the input on the informed consent form, however, only in the agreement and approval of the sponsor. Neither the investigator, nor the trial staff, should coerce or unduly influence a subject to participate or to continue to participate in a trial. None of the oral and written information concerning the trial, including the written informed consent form, should contain any language that causes the subject, or the subject's legally acceptable representative, to waive or to appear to waive any legal rights, or that releases or appears to release the investigator, the institution, the sponsor, or their agents from liability for negligence. The investigator, or a person designated by the investigator, should fully inform the subject or, if the subject is unable to provide informed consent, the subject's legally acceptable representative, of all pertinent aspects of the trial including the written information and the approval or favorable opinion by the IRB, IEC. The language used, in the oral and written information about the trial, including the written informed consent form, should be as non-technical as practical, and should be understandable to the subject, or the subject's legally acceptable representative, and the impartial witness, where applicable. Before informed consent may be obtained, the investigator, or a person designated by the investigator, should provide the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative ample time and opportunity to inquire about details of the trial, and to decide whether or not to participate in the trial. All questions about the trial should be answered to the satisfaction of the subject, or the subject's legally acceptable representative. Prior to a subject's participation in the trial, the written informed consent form should be signed, and personally dated by the subject or by the subject's legally acceptable representative, and by the person who conducted the informed consent discussion. Please note, that one of the most common audit findings, is that the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative, did not enter the date itself in the informed consent form. The date in the informed consent form, is just as important as the signature itself. Be assured, that auditors and inspectors will take some time to review informed consent forms. Depending on the number of the recruited subjects at the research site, auditors and inspectors usually check all informed consent forms, signed by the study subjects. If a subject is unable to read, or if a legally acceptable representative is unable to read, an impartial witness should be present during the entire informed consent discussion. After the written informed consent form, and any other written information to be provided to subjects is read and explained to the subject, or the subject's legally acceptable representative. And after the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative, has orally consented to the subject's participation in the trial and, if capable of doing so, has signed and personally dated the informed consent form, the witness should sign and personally date the consent form. By signing the consent form, the witness attests that the information in the consent form, and any other written information was accurately explained to, and apparently understood by, the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative, and that informed consent was freely given by the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative. The design of modern clinical trials is becoming increasingly complex. The requirements for subjects to complete diaries and questionnaires make it very difficult for patients who cannot read to participate in a clinical trial. Please review the inclusion and exclusion criteria of the protocol carefully, and seek advice from the sponsor or sponsor representative, before the inclusion of the subject who cannot read in the study. Both, the informed consent discussion, and the written informed consent form and any other written information to be provided to subjects, should include explanations of the following: that the trial involves research. The purpose of the trial. The trial treatments and the probability for random assignment to each treatment. The trial procedures to be followed, including all invasive procedures. The subject's responsibilities. Those aspects of the trial that are experimental. The reasonably foreseeable risks or inconveniences to the subject and, when applicable, to an embryo, fetus, or nursing infant. The reasonably expected benefits. When there is no intended clinical benefit to the subject should be made aware of this. The alternative procedures or courses of treatment that may be available to the subject, and their important potential benefits and risks. The compensation and/or treatment available to the subject in the event of trial-related injury. The anticipated prorated payment, if any, to the subject for participating in the trial. The anticipated expenses, if any, to the subject for participating in the trial. That the subject's participation in the trial is voluntary and that the subject may refuse to participate or withdraw from the trial, at any time, without penalty, or loss of benefits to which the subject is otherwise entitled. That the monitors, the auditors, the IRB, IEC, and the regulatory authorities, will be granted direct access to the subject's original medical records for verification of clinical trial procedures and/or data, without violating the confidentiality of the subject, to the extent permitted by the applicable laws and regulations, and that, by signing a written informed consent form, the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative is authorizing such access. That records identifying the subject will be kept confidential and, to the extent permitted by the applicable laws and/or regulations, will not be made publicly available. If the results of the trial are published, the subject's identity will remain confidential. That the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative will be informed in a timely manner if information becomes available that may be relevant to the subject's willingness to continue participation in the trial. The persons to contact for further information regarding the trial and the rights of trial subjects, and whom to contact in the event of trial-related injury. The foreseeable circumstances and/or reasons under which the subject's participation in the trial may be terminated. The expected duration of the subject's participation in the trial. The approximate number of subjects involved in the trial. Prior to participation in the trial, the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative should receive a copy of the signed and dated written informed consent form, and any other written information provided to the subjects. During a subject's participation in the trial, the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative should receive a copy of the signed and dated consent form updates and a copy of any amendments to the written information provided to subjects. When a clinical trial, therapeutic or non-therapeutic, includes subjects who can only be enrolled in the trial with the consent of the subject's legally acceptable representative, for example, minors, or patients with severe dementia, the subject should be informed about the trial to the extent compatible with the subject's understanding and, if capable, the subject should sign, and personally date the written informed consent. A non-therapeutic trial, for example, a trial in which there is no anticipated direct clinical benefit to the subject, should be conducted in subjects who personally give consent and who sign and date the written informed consent form. Non-therapeutic trials may be conducted in subjects with consent of a legally acceptable representative, provided the following conditions are fulfilled. The objectives of the trial cannot be met by means of a trial in subjects who can give informed consent personally. The foreseeable risks to the subjects are low. The negative impact on the subject's well-being is minimized and low. The trial is not prohibited by law. The approval or favorable opinion of the IRB, IEC, is expressly sought on the inclusion of such subjects, and the written approval or favorable opinion covers this aspect. Such trials, unless an exception is justified, should be conducted in patients having a disease or condition, for which the investigational product is intended. Subjects in these trials should be particularly closely monitored, and should be withdrawn if they appear to be unduly distressed. In emergency situations, when prior consent of the subject is not possible, the consent of the subject's legally acceptable representative, if present, should be requested. When prior consent of the subject is not possible, and the subject's legally acceptable representative is not available, enrollment of the subject should require measures described in the protocol and/or elsewhere. With documented approval favorable opinion by the IRB, IEC, to protect the rights, safety and well-being of the subject, and to ensure compliance with applicable regulatory requirements. The subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative should be informed about the trial as soon as possible, and consent to continue and other consent as appropriate should be requested. The process of obtaining informed consent from subjects is a critical point of entry for research participants. It is also one of the most important facets of bioethics, and it has applications outside of just clinical trials.